Hey everyone. So in this video I want to talk about the Berlin Endgame using this model game played by Fabi against Magnus in the 2025 Clutch Chess Championships. And yeah, this was a really nice game by Fabi because he beat Magnus 2-0 and it was like two really nice games. First off, he beat Magnus with white in this game in the Berlin, and then he beat Magnus as black. So it was really nice to see. And yeah, I wanted to show this because it was very interesting, if you don't understand the Berlin Endgame, then it might seem like, what are the point of these moves? Why is white choosing this setup against another setup? Why are the pieces placed in a certain way? And so, yeah, that's what I want to sort of investigate, what are the different tries, using this game as like a foundation. So yeah, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Magnus chooses the move knight f6, the Berlin. And here, Fabi just plays castles and allows the transition towards the Berlin endgame. After knight takes e4, d4, the other big move is rook e1, and this has been tried. For example, knight d6. Normally the line goes like knight takes e5, and these enter, this sort of transition gets into like a very equal position normally. And in this position, if white does play the move d4, then I think black is doing perfectly fine after bishop f6, let's say rook e1, and then here even knight f5 I think is perfectly good. Let's say c3, black plays d5, and the position is very symmetrical. I don't think that anyone is disagreeing that this position is a simply draw in most cases. But instead of that, there's also an interesting way to play, which is in this position to play the move knight c3, with the intent that after black plays, normally here black plays a move like knight e8. The intent is to play d5 next, but then white can play knight d5 before black is ready to do it. And then let's say we play bishop d6, rook comes to e1, and then we get this position with c6, and then knight comes to e3. And the idea is that black sort of has not played the move d5 yet, and so if black does not get the pawn to d5, then it can get at least somewhat interesting. For example, bishop e7 here, white can play c4 instead of d4. Because of course whenever we play d4, black plays d5 and has a very comfortable game, right? This should be a draw. So that's why white's other tries are basically just to avoid black, black putting a pawn on the center and getting a symmetrical position. So this is possible, one interesting way to play. Another one is in this position after knight d6, both the moves a4, this has been tried as well, but also the move bishop a4 in this position. Both of these moves have been tried, and I think they're worth investigating. The move a4 is also particularly interesting, I think. Like, for example, whenever black plays f6, which is not a good move, then white can blast open the center with d4. And that's really good. So here, like, black should probably just try to get back the pawn, but here white's idea is to go knight c3 and knight d5. So not transitioning the game, into like a very symmetrical position, but trying to keep the game alive somewhat with the move knight d5 next. So very interesting way to play. And there was a really nice game that Niemann played against Aronian. So Niemann played this idea with white, and he, I think, got a really good position against Aronian, but the game eventually ended in draw because Aronian had like really good defensive. He had really good defense. So these are a couple of interesting directions. But here I want to talk about the Berlin endgame with d4. And here black's idea is to play knight d6. After bishop takes c6, dc6, d takes e5, black plays knight f5, and now we trade off the queens and enter this position. So first off, the question here is that what is the move that white should play, right? So here there are a couple of moves. The big point is that white sort of wants to transition the game into an endgame where white's majority on the king side here, 4 versus 3, can potentially be used to create a passed pawn and just win the game. For example, the ideal situation is that if white can play f4, g4, and advance the king towards the center and just like push these pawns forward. Black does have the bishop here, but if the bishops cannot get active, then which normally like they can't, then white is doing like very well in the endgame. So this is the big point, and the question is that how should white play in this position and how should black play? So black fundamentally has two ways to play. They can bring the king over to c8 and bring it towards the queen side, or they can bring the king over to e8. And based on where black chooses to develop the king to e8 or c8, then we can decide where to put this bishop. For example, if the king goes to c8 here, then we can see that the queen side is well defended, for example, the c7 pawn. So in that case, it would make sense for white to play b3 and bishop b2 to put some pressure on the queen side. Meanwhile, if black plays king e8, which is considered to be generally a safer approach, then white can often put the bishop to f4 to introduce some pressure on the e6, on the c7 pawn, especially after white pushes the pawn to e6. So we will see these sort of ideas in this game. And so here, the most flexible move is actually the move h3, which Fabi played in the game. And the idea is, of course, like at some point white can play g4, but not too early. If white plays g4 too early, then black can simply move the knight away, and then hit white with the move h5, and the kingside pawns can become vulnerable there. So white should of course be careful with this move. But with the move h3, it's very flexible, right? White can also play the move knight c3. It doesn't create a huge difference, but I think that what white should avoid is committing this rook too early, for example to d1, because in some cases the a rook can actually go to d1. For example, if white can get the ideal setup of bringing the knight over to c3, like let's say in a situation where white plays like knight c3, black plays like king e8, for example, and then here white plays like bishop f4, for example. Here, if black plays like a sort of like a passive setup, with a move like knight e7, for example, trying to bring the knight over to g6, which is sometimes an idea seen, the issue is that white gets the rook from a1 to d1. And after, let's say, knight g6, white can often, like develop the bishop to put the bishop to g3, and sort of like white's pieces can get really active with knight e4, knight d4 next. Also, h4, e5 is commonly an idea here. So I think these positions are quite nice for white. Additionally, an idea of bringing the a rook to d1 is that the bishop can actually drop back to c1 in case, like, let's say, black plays a move like h6, g5, you see. I think it's more common to be seen like in a position like this. Like, let's say black plays like a careless move like a5 here, which doesn't do anything, and rook 8 to d1, developing the piece. And here, for example, a move like knight d7 would be really bad here, because I think essentially whenever black plays knight g6, you can always bring the bishop over to c1. For example, white can put the knight over to d4, or even rook f to e1. I don't think it matters too much. But after knight g6, white can even like coordinate their pieces perfectly with a move like bishop c1, because knight takes c5 is not possible on a kind of rook e1 followed by f4, winning a piece. And if this is not possible, then this rook on d1 is perfectly placed, while white can push f4 and eventually f5, right? Like for example, f4, h3, g4, f5, and these, this is basically like a huge advantage already for white. So that's the fundamental idea as to why maybe you wouldn't want to put the rook to d1 too early, right? But we can see that the knight always goes to c3, and generally the pawn goes to h3 because it's quite flexible, and at some point in the future, like g4 is an idea. So this is the move that Fabi played. And here Magnus uses the move king e8. So king e8, as I said before, is generally like considered a safer setup, and it does defend like the king side better. But in these cases, like white should prepare a move like bishop f4 to exert pressure on c7, right? Here white plays knight c3, the most flexible move, and here black has a decision. The two main moves are the move h5 to prevent any ideas of g4, as well as introducing some ideas of pushing the pawn over to h4. If black can push the pawn to h4, the idea is to prevent any ideas of white pushing g4, right? So that's one of the critical ideas. Whenever white pushes g4, then black can take en passant and create some weaknesses on h3 and g3. So this is the idea behind h5. There's also another interesting line with bishop e7, but we'll talk about this next. So after the move h5 here, white plays the move bishop f4. There is also an interesting line to go for the move knight e2, intending knight e4, and possibly e6. I'll also talk about that after the coverage of this game. But bishop f4 is by far the main move, and the idea is simple, that at some point e6 is a potential push to think about. So here now black plays the move bishop e7. So black develops and prepares at some point to push the pawn to h4 and restrict white's kingside pawns. So that's the big idea. And now here white plays rook 8 to d1. So we can see that by not putting the f rook on d1, the a rook can actually go to d1, and this is much better, right? And now here, black I think has some moves. Black can play knight h4, trying to exchange some pieces. I think that this line, black needs to be quite precise. But that's also the case with the move bishop e6, which I think seems more solid, developing the last piece. Of course, we can see that both of these rooks are like passive right now, but for example, after white plays knight g5, which is generally the idea to meet bishop e6, trying to win the bishop, here black's idea is to play the move rook h6. And once we take the bishop off the board, black's rook can get active and potentially swing over to the queen side here. So here Fabi plays the move rook f to e1, which I think is the most precise, just developing the last piece. And here Carlsen makes the first inaccuracy. He plays the move h4. So as I explained before, like h4 is generally a move that black wants to play, but the issue is that if at some point white can push the pawn to g4, then even then, like this pawn on h4 doesn't really do its job, The big idea is, of course, like if white pushes g4, then it can like create some weaknesses on the king side. But we can see that since these bishops are still on the board, essentially white can try to take advantage of it and still try to advance with a move like g4. If black has already advanced the pawn to h4, then generally it's okay to trade off these Archer bishops. That's a point that I learned from Sam Shanklin when he covered the Berlin. So yeah, h4 is already serious inaccuracy here, and here white just continues with knight takes e6, grabbing the bishop, rook takes e6, and then now knight e4. So the idea is to cover the g5 square, preventing black from advancing the pawn to g5, right? And now here, black plays c5, trying to open up the rook's path towards the queen side, trying to create some weaknesses here. And now white plays c3. So it also covers the d4 square, preventing any ideas of knight d4. So this is quite good. And in this position, Carlsen made another inaccuracy, which is the move c4. So what he should have done is probably play a move like rook b6, and then eventually like try to create some weaknesses to rook a6 and get a position like this. Try to trade off one pair of rooks, and then like even if white pushes g4, then they can sort of like try to get some counterplay with b4. But still, white is better here, and this idea of h4 followed by h5 and then later kicking away the knight with g4 is a serious idea, and black needs to be really precise, but this should be still in the drawing margin. So this is what Carlsen should have went for, but instead he plays the move c4, which is logical to somewhat like freeze the pawns, right? On the queen side. So here white plays g4, and this is the idea, is that if black pushes h4, but it doesn't really prevent white from pushing g4, then white can still do it anyways, and oftentimes can get like a huge kingside majority. So after a takes g3 and f takes g3, black plays b5. And now here, Fabi plays the move king f2. King g2 was better, but just to avoid any potential like bishop h4 checks in this case, you know, after king f2, there are some, as soon as we play g4, there's bishop h4, trying to trade some pieces. So king g2 is actually better, but still, Fabi played still a good move here, king f2. Black played b4, trying to get some counterplay. This is very important. White plays rook e2, and then now here, Carlsen plays another mistake, which is rook b8. After this move, white is already like technically winning. So here, Fabi continues with h4, and he understands the position completely, that he needs to get these kingside pawns going, and he doesn't really care about the queenside pawns. What happened in the game was Carlsen played rook a6, and now white played h5. He understands that Fabi understands that this pawn on a2 is irrelevant to the situation. King f8 was played, trying to bring the king closer to control this h pawn, but now g4, knight h6. Also, another point is after knight h4, the issue is that because white has pushed g4 and h5 already, this knight is actually trapped after bishop g5. So that's another reason that white actually played h4 and h5 first before playing the move g4. So knight h6, and now king f3. Carlsen grabs the pawn on a2, and now g5. So this initiative is already like objectively winning. After black plays knight f5, white plays king g4, activating the king, and now after g6 here, there are many moves that win. For example, h6 would have been quite nice as well, but this relies on a more tactical solution. After h7, king g7, and now the move e6. Both attacking c7 and also introducing ideas of bishop e5 check. So this is also winning, and even better. But I think Caruana played a good choice here with h6, g6. Very simple, and now he played e6, opening up the bishop's diagonal. Now after bishop d6, trying to defend, here white plays knight f6, b takes c3 was played, and now here white could have taken on d6. I think this would have been cleanest, something like this, and then bringing the rook over to h1, and then after check, e7, this should be just checkmating very soon. So that's one of the possible lines, but instead, okay, this was a rapid game, so Caruana played the move rook h1. After bishop takes f4, rook h7, and this was really nice sequence, threatening the move rook f7. Black had to play knight g7, and now rook h8 was played, and now Fabi wins the rook. Black tries to get some counterplay with the passed pawns, but this was not enough. After takes, knight d5, knight takes f4, c3. The final move of the game was the move knight e2, and suddenly the black pawns are stuck. This pawn will be won next, and black can't even advance a pawn to c2 because the b2 pawn will be hanging. So very, very nice win by Fabi against Magnus. So even though, you know, we've sort of accepted that the Berlin Endgame is like equal, and maybe the reason that a lot of people don't want to enter like these endgames because it's considered to be so equal, it does show that black needs to be very precise. I mean, both sides really need to be precise, but yeah, it does seem like black is the one that needs to find a lot of these like only moves or only ideas, basically. So yeah, going back into this game, maybe I want to talk about a couple of different deviations that can be played. For example, what are the different setups in this position after king takes d8 and h3? So here, yeah, the most popular move is king e8, and I think that this is the big point, is that another idea is for black to eventually play b6, bishop b7, but black shouldn't do this like too early, because if they play b6, bishop b7, I think white can eventually look to advance the pawns on the king side very quickly, and the bishop on b7, it can be potentially good against the move c5, but it also gives up the b5 and d5 squares. So in a lot of these situations, developing the bishop to the long diagonal is not really possible unless white is like playing quite slowly. And I'll show an example. For example, after h3, king e8, knight c3, all the most flexible moves here. If black plays like a move like h5, and here white plays a move like knight e2. So the idea, as I mentioned before, is the knight wants to go to f4, introduce some ideas of e6 in the future. And here, because white plays a move knight e2 and it's a bit slow, black can actually play the move b6 now and try to develop the bishop to the long diagonal. Now we can see that when the bishop goes to the long diagonal, if black can play c5 and potentially take on f3, then these kingside pawns will be really weak. So that's the big idea. Now, here there are a couple of interesting lines. White can play rook d1, which is most popular, but I also like the move bishop g5 here. Here, the point is that if black plays bishop e7, as I mentioned before, and as what Shanklin has explained, is sort of that black does not want to exchange off these other bishops when black has not played the pawn to h4. Because after we exchange the bishops, let's say after rook a to d1 first, bishop b7, white can take on e7, and then eventually bring the knight to f4, introducing some ideas of e6. For example, e6 takes, and the knight g6 is already a huge threat. For example, here white can play c5, but just before black is able to take on f3, white plays the move knight g5 and introduces ideas of like e6, but also rook e1. And there was a couple of like high-level games here. The most notable one was Grishik versus Caruana. And after rook h6, which is an inaccuracy, here actually the computer recommends just to play rook h d8, giving like the pawn on h5 basically, and just hoping to hold the draw. But this is a very inhuman way to play, right? So I think Caruana played the most logical move, which is rook h6, preventing any ideas of e6. But still, white just played c3 first off. And after f6, okay, I mean, c3 just holds everything together. At some point, rook e1, and then e6 is coming, you know. But here, after f6, e6, f6, king takes f6, knight f to e6. This is actually just like completely like crushing position. At some point, g4 can come, f4, rook e1, and this is already really good. And this is how Grishik eventually won the game. He supported his knight with f4, knight to e3, and now rook to d7. So okay, the fork is not relevant because rook f7 is a threat. So here, this is why Caruana played the move rook takes g5. But now after knight takes g5, knight takes f1, king takes f1, rook c8, g4, cutting out the king, takes, and this position was already technically winning for white. White's rook is just so active. White has the pawn majority on the king side. The king is completely cut out, and this is, yeah, I mean, like already like rook f7 potentially is a threat, but also like everything is just like crushing here. White can even like slowly bring the king up the board, you know, and this is really good. So this is sort of like why black needs to be careful in this knight e2, knight f4 line. Yeah, so after knight e2, b6, here they move bishop g5, and then now here, this is why bishop e7 is actually a mistake, as we can see that exchanging the darts of bishops in general before black has played h4 is not a good idea for black. So that's why bishop e7 is more common, and black is just in time to take on f3 here. For example, rook a to d1, c5, and we can see that as soon as black plays c5, they give up control over this b5 and d5 squares. So yeah, earlier on when the knight was still on c3, it wasn't really good to play the move like b6 here. For example, in this position to play b6, because black can't even get c5 because knight b5 or knight d5 are quite annoying moves to deal with. So this is why, for example, here bishop, maybe here after knight e2, b6, rook bishop g5, bishop b7, rook a to d1, c5, and now knight c3. So white is ready to jump on d5 or b5 and cause some problems. So here there are a couple of different directions. Bishop takes f3 has been tried. This is a very concrete solution, but still I think black needs to be very precise. After g takes f3 here, there is a threat of knight b5, so black needs to be careful. So here black plays normally c6, and now white brings the knight over to e4, centralizing the knight and potentially infiltrating to d6 next. Black plays normally bishop e7, and now f4. Now this enters like some high level games have been seen here, bishop g5, f takes g5, and now black needs to be very careful. They have to play the move king e7. If they play a move like rook d8 here, this is already like very, very bad. White can exchange off the rooks and play the move knight d6. Now, because there's a threat on f7 and the knight, black is forced to take, and now white plays the intermezzo rook d1. And finally, they activate the rook, plays f4 next, and has a really, really pleasant endgame. So this is how we can see, like, even if the position is so simplified, this endgame is just so good for white because all of the kingside pawns have marshaled the board, and black's double pawns are really useless in this sort of position, right? So that's why like black needs to be very careful and plays king e7. After knight d6, the idea is that they bring the king over to e6. White can play f4, defending the pawns, and now black can take on d6 and then get this sort of position. And finally, like black is defending, and I think black should be able to hold this. So that's one of the solutions here. The move bishop takes f3. It is also possible actually for black to play bishop e7. Okay, and the situation has somewhat changed because, normally we don't want to exchange. Black does not want to exchange off these bishops when black has not played h4, right? But we can see that in this position, the bishop is very active on this diagonal, so it's not really one-sided as before. So yeah, there is a threat of bishop takes f3 just to win material. So white should jump on the opportunity to play knight d5. And now after takes, rook d8, exchanging one pair of rooks. So it's important for black to not allow both of the rooks to double on the d file, because that would be very dangerous. It would make this rook very, very passive, and black would be, suffering here basically with a move like rook d7 coming and things like that. So this is why rook d8 is important before white is able to double up the rooks. And now we can exchange off the rooks. And here, I think very solid move is the move bishop takes d8. The idea is to force the king over to d8. White plays rook d1, developing a tempo, and for king e7, white plays the move g3. Now, there was a very nice game here played by Bakro, in 2024, where he managed to beat Carlsen. I hope I said that right. But the idea is that, like the issue behind the move h5 is that if black does not push h4, then at some point white can improve the position and look to advance the pawn to g4 next. And, white still has some sort of advantage here because they have the kingside majority here. So black needs to be really precise. And the most precise move here is the move rook g8, which is played by black. But still, white plays h4, preventing black from playing g5. So this is the big idea. Black wants to play g5 and g4 next, potentially. So here white plays h4. Now black plays a5, useful move in general. And white plays c3, also useful move. And in this position, black played knight h6. After white plays knight g5, here black started to go wrong with the move knight g4. This is the start of the problems. Even though it seems like possibly potentially just very okay, it runs into move e6. But this is the reason why black should have played the move rook to d8, exchanging off the rooks, and then after f3 cutting out the g4 square, king e7, this position should be completely equal. And I think the game should be a routine draw. But instead, black played the move knight g4, which looks quite reasonable, but the issue is that it allows e6. Okay, and the threat is rook d7 now, so black needs to respond. F takes e6. And now rook e1. And now the pawn on e6 actually falls, and white gets a lot of activity here. For example, the game continues something like this. Rook e2, king g2, rook d2 check, knight h3, rerouting the knight over to f4, rook c2, knight f4. And after some very careful play here, white was simply better in this position and ended up winning the game. Just because of the pawn majority. So even in a simplified position, we can see that black needs to be very careful. And black was a strong player, very, very strong player. So this was not, a case of the position, of just a simple blunder. It was just slow inaccuracies that out in move 20 something, move 23 that led to black's loss in this game. So we can see that I think this system is quite interesting as well for white to play if they do want to enter the Berlin Endgame. To go for this, okay, h3, knight c3, very standard, but then go for this knight e2 plan. This is quite interesting and challenging. But yeah, bishop f4 I think is by far the main line. And I hope this video was somewhat useful. It kind of explained the intricacies of the Berlin Endgame. And I think this game, when I saw this live, it was a really huge revelation as to why, oh wow, I need to understand these positions better. And queenless middle game positions, very interesting and I think worth investigating. So I hope this was good or somewhat interesting, and thanks so much for watching. See ya.